Your Humanities Half Hour is brought to you by the Northern Marianas Humanities Council.
Welcome to Your Humanities Half Hour. I'm Catherine Perry, and it's my pleasure to have in studio today Emeritus Professor Dr Bellwood of the School of Archaeology and Anthropology of the Australian National University. Welcome to Your Humanities Half Hour, Dr. Bellwood.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you.
I understand this is your first time in the Marianas. What's your impression?
Yes, it is. Well, I've been here about one day so far. We just went to Tinian this morning to visit the House of Targa latte site. So, yes, I mean, they're beautiful islands, nice and warm. So I'm very happy to be here.
Well, thank you for coming. And originally you're from England. How did
Yes.
you end up on this side of the world?
Well, I studied archaeology in England at Cambridge many years ago now, in the 1960s, and then when I graduated I took up my first lecturing job that was at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, and for about 6 years I did research in Polynesia, in the Cook Islands, the Marquesas Society Islands. I was very interested in the topic of migration, so that got me interested in Polynesians because, of course, they're the world's ultimate migrants, I suppose, across sea. In 1973, I moved to Australia, to the Australian National University, and started my current research projects in Southeast Asia. I mean, nowadays my research is mostly in Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia, and has been for the last several decades. So that's really how I come to be here. In terms of being in Saipan right now today, the main reason is that I've just been in Korea giving a lecture to a group of archaeologists in Seoul. And because Seoul, of course, is an easy place to travel from to reach Saipan, there are direct flights, I decided I would drop in for a few days and visit my colleagues, Dr. Mike Carson and Dr. Xiaochun Hong, who are both conducting excavations in the archaeological site called Unai Bapot, which is in Lau Lau Bay, here on Saipan.
Well, you gave a presentation on behalf of the Northern Marianas Humanities Council entitled, Who Were the First Settlers of the Mariana Islands?
Yes.
For those that weren't able to make the presentation, I'm going to ask you a great favor to help us by hitting some of the highlights. I'm sure there are a lot of people who are interested to know what your theories are.
Yes. Well, of course, the question arises, how did the first people reach the Marianas and for what reason? And you have to go back a long way deep in time to understand that, and you have to look at lots of different sources of information. One of them, of course, is the Chamorro language. As it survives today with many changes and borrowings from Spanish, but the Chamorro language is Austronesian and originally would have come here from Southeast Asia. Now, exactly where in Southeast Asia is a matter of some debate. Some linguists think the Philippines, and I think that is a very likely answer to the question. The second source of information is DNA, or genetics. The genetics of modern people, their mitochondrial DNA, their genomics, that is the autosomal DNA. And we are hoping soon to have some results from also ancient DNA from bones. We don't have those results yet, but maybe soon. A third source is the study of skeletons, tracing and comparing skeletons between different areas. And the fourth source, which is the one I'm most interested in and involved in, is archaeology, which deals with the remains left behind by humans in or on the ground as a result of their lifestyles and their dwellings and so forth. And archaeology at the moment suggests that the first people to reach the Mariana Islands about 3,500 years ago possibly came from the Philippines. We know that because of the intricate decoration that they made on the surfaces of their pottery. Of course, those pots got broken, but the potsherds, because pottery survives for thousands of years, it's a very, very sturdy material. It doesn't decay. Potsherds stay in the ground we can excavate them, reconstruct how the pots might have looked, and then compare them with places like the Philippines, Indonesia, the Melanesian islands to the south, and we can see many interesting relationships. So to cut a rather long story short, as far as we know, the ancestors of the Chamorro-speaking people would have arrived here about 3,500 years ago, possibly by a direct voyage from the Philippines, and if so, that would have been over 2,300 kilometres of open sea, so it's a dramatic achievement. They might have come through islands further to the south, like Palau or Yap. We're really not sure because, of course, there are many gaps in the knowledge, and with a subject like archaeology, you can know what you do know, which you've recovered, but you can never quite know what it is that you haven't recovered. So, of course, for obvious reasons, the sample, if you like, of archaeological material is always going to be somewhat biased and difficult to interpret. So that's what we think. Not everybody agrees with me, but I'm not sure what everybody thinks, actually. Many people don't say very clearly what they think, but there has been dispute recently about whether it's the Philippines or Sulawesi or Halmahera or somewhere like that was the first source of the Chamorro.
Well, let's talk a little bit about this pottery. Pre-Latte period pottery, of course, was finer than and had these intricate designs. I believe it was around the lip of the pottery.
Yes, and the upper part, yes.
Circles that they feel may have been
That's right.
printed by
stamping of some sort, but probably a vegetable and a tubular plant stem, a reed. Yes, I think so.
And how similar are these designs to what is found in the Philippines?
Well, some of them are almost identical. I mean, there are two elements here. One is the use of the rows of stamped circles. The other is the use of a band outlined by lines drawn in the clay, in which they filled up by stamping with an instrument rather like a hair comb, but with the ends of the comb cut off to make little rectangles rather than points. Or sometimes it's points, sometimes it's little rectangles. But whatever it is, this archaeologists call it punctate or dentate stamping. Whatever it is, it's these zones between these horizontal lines are very typical of pottery in the northern Philippines, the central Philippines, also one or two sites in Sulawesi Island in the middle of Indonesia, and in the Bismarck archipelago of the western Pacific, and what is called Lapita pottery that goes right through into Polynesia, and also, of course, most importantly for us, here in the Mariana Islands. So there are these very widespread similarities in the decoration, and they also painted the pottery red, which is another very typical feature.
They say there are several things that a society will have needed to have developed in order for them to make this vast voyage over the ocean and then set up a new life. One of that being, for example, agriculture or the construction of the houses.
Yes.
What similarities are we seeing between the archaeological evidence here and what is found?
Well, the two fundamental things, of course, if you're going to found a new settlement in an island far away, you have to have good boats. Now, we don't find archaeological boats very much. There are fragments of dugout canoes in China, Neolithic China, that date back sort of 7,000-8,000 years. But we don't find whole outrigger boats with sails like the ones recorded for Micronesia in the 18th and 19th centuries, the flying proas, I think, as the Spanish called them at the time. But you have to have a boat that is sufficiently strong, that can carry passengers, that can be balanced either with a double hull or an outrigger, and you would have to have a sail. Well, paddling can work to an extent, but sailing, of course, a pandanus matting sail would be very important in all of this. Now, we know that boats of this type did exist in the world. I mean, if you go back into, say, somewhere like Egypt, the Egyptian pharaoh Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid in Giza, has a majestic wooden ship buried at the side of his pyramid. And that was of a planking system where the planks were lashed together, rather similar to that of many ethnographic, 18th, 19th century boats in the Pacific. Well, that boat in Egypt, of course, is 4,600 years old. So we know that the world did know about that technology before the Mariana Islands were reached. The other thing is you need passengers, and I have to say you do need women aboard. I mean, this is very obvious to everybody, I think.
Yes.
If you're going to have a few people in a boat, obviously the number of men doesn't matter terribly. The number of women, if you're going to be isolated, the number of women is very, very important. And those women have to be fairly young, and of course, obviously fertile and able to have children. Otherwise, these populations will die out. I mean, unless they're backed up. They will disappear, so that's very important. Then you have to have your crops, your domestic animals, maybe pigs and dogs, although in the case of the Mariana Islands, they don't appear successfully to have brought pigs and dogs. We're not really sure. They might have done, and they might have died out. There's a few questions about that. They might have brought some rice too, but again, we're not sure. We don't really have a lot of information about the first crops that they brought, because the evidence often doesn't survive very well. But when I look back at their ancestors in, say, the Philippines, we know from the archaeology that we do there and in Taiwan that they did have pigs and dogs originally, and chickens maybe, not so sure. They certainly grew rice. They would have had foxtail millet. They would have had yams, taro, bananas, breadfruit maybe, and a few other sort of sugar cane as well, possibly. So a mixture of cereal crops like rice and millet that come from China, and a mixture of tuberous and fruit crops like yam and taro and banana that are native to the islands of Southeast Asia. And they must have attempted to bring all of that to the Marianas. Now, how successful they were, we don't really know, but they must have got some crops here, because of course some of these crops were growing when Europeans discovered these islands, including rice. I think that somehow rice appears to have arrived here in ancient times. Quite when and how, we don't really know.
A lot of times when people think about the very early people living in the Marianas, the ancient Chamorros, they think of latte stones holding up structures, but that may have not actually been the first structure.
No. Well, we know from the archaeology the latte are relatively recent. They're within the last 800 years or something like that. This morning I've just been to visit the House of Targa on Tinian, which is a wonderful site, even though the pillars have now, all but one, have collapsed. But those structures, of course, are pile dwellings or houses on stilts. Now, houses on stilts go back to 8,000 or 10,000 years ago in waterlogged sites in southern China, in the Yangtze Delta, but they're of wood. In those areas, and at that time, they were not using stone. So everybody has known how to raise their houses off the ground to keep out vermin, snakes, rats, whatever, to protect them from the elements. But here, for some reason, about 1,000 years ago, they began to carve them out of coral rock from the uplifted coral beds around the coastline. Exactly why they did that, I don't know. Perhaps it was, they might have run out of timber, but that's a rather doubtful explanation. I think it could be that it was competitive building. They wanted to impress their neighbours or something like that. We don't really know. Perhaps we never will know. But those latte are unique to the Mariana Islands.
Well, we're speaking today with Emeritus Professor Peter Bellwood of the School of Archaeology and Anthropology of the Australian National University. He's been here in the Marianas this week presenting the presentation, Who Were the First Settlers of the Mariana Islands? And we'll be back with more questions for him after this break.
On October 28th, the Northern Marianas Humanities Council invites you to join us in celebrating our 25th anniversary fundraiser at Pacific Islands Club. Tickets are $50 and include a seafood and steak dinner buffet, live entertainment, a raffle and silent auction, and a keynote address by noted environmental activist and poet Kathy Jenil Kitchener. All proceeds will go toward funding more public humanities programs and projects in our community. For tickets, call 235-4785 or stop by our office at the Springs Plaza building on Middle Road, Gualarai. We look forward to celebrating with you.
Welcome back to Your Humanities Half Hour. We're speaking today with Emeritus Professor Peter Bellwood from the Australian National University. Dr. Bellwood, what are some of the other theories about why or how the Marianas were first settled, and why is the theory you're presenting now most valid, you feel?
Well, first of all, of course, older theories. If you go back to the 18th century, in those days there was no archaeology, no genetics. Most of the theorizing in the days of Captain Cook were done from languages. And on his second voyage, Captain Cook and his scientist colleague, Johann Reinhold Forster, a German scholar who was travelling with his son George on the Resolution on the second voyage, they collected lists of words from all of the islands across the Pacific. They went to Manila and collected Tagalog. They came to the Mariana Islands and collected words from Chamorro, and they went to Tahiti. They hadn't discovered Hawaii until the third voyage, but they went to Tahiti and New Zealand and Tanna, I think, in Vanuatu, and many other places, Jakarta, recording Malay, and they compared all of these words, and they could see that the Polynesians, like the Tahitians, who were of great interest to them because they were a very long way from Asia, they could see that they came from Asia. And I think Johann Reinhold Forster wrote a sort of a famous short piece in his diaries saying that all of these related languages have a common source, and these people migrated from the sort of area of Asia, Philippines, through islands, separate islands across the Pacific from the west towards the east. Now, Forster, in fact, was probably quite right. Obviously, we know a lot more now, but he had the essence of a good theory, which I think still works today. Of course, the Chamorro people, as a specific population, must have come from somewhere in Southeast Asia. They didn't come from the Arctic Circle or South America. I mean, that is patently obvious. As far as South America is concerned, there was a famous theory in the late 40s and 50s, Thor Heyerdahl, who some of your listeners might have heard of. He was the one who organised the Kon-Tiki expedition in 1947, a very famous expedition that attempted to sail, well, that did sail, or that did drift from South America to the Tuamotu Islands in Polynesia. Heyerdahl wanted to show that the first settlers in the Pacific were South Americans from South America, especially in Polynesia, and that the Polynesians themselves came in later. He didn't really have any theories about the Mariana Islands. He was really interested mostly in the eastern part of the Pacific. But he was one of many who thought that the Pacific had been essentially settled from the Americas. We know now from languages, DNA and archaeology that is incorrect. This is not possible. The Pacific was settled from the west, from the islands of Southeast Asia. However, there are a lot of sort of smaller little aspects of all of this where there is argument. As I said before, people might argue as to where the first people of the Marianas, the first Chamorro, actually came from. Was it the Philippines? Was it Sulawesi? Well, I favour the Philippines.
I've heard Taiwan.
Well, Taiwan is less likely for linguistic reasons because the Chamorro speak what is called a Malayo-Polynesian language, like the Philippine ones. The Taiwan ones are a little bit different. They're called Formosan languages, and there are some differences. But it's not certain, and of course the Taiwan is so close to the Philippines it probably doesn't really matter. It's much the same.
True.
Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm.
Now, as I mentioned, you've been doing this for decades, studying this, and you have a number of publications, including Man's Conquest of the Pacific, First Migrants, First Farmers.
Yeah.
Well, how do you feel that there is a way to balance what may be a people's oral tradition of where they came from with the approach we're taking with modern technology today?
Well, those books, like First Farmers and First Migrants, of course, they're not just about the Pacific. They're about the whole world, of beginnings of agriculture everywhere, the Middle East, China, Africa, South America, and so forth. And the same with First Migrants. As for oral tradition, well, as I said before, of course, as an archaeologist, or as a prehistorian, if you like, as someone trying to understand the history of humans before written records became common, we look at four disciplines, like the archaeology, languages, the genetics, and the skeletal evidence.
What is
skeletons? From burials, yes. Of course, archaeologists often find burials, sometimes well preserved, sometimes not. Those bones can be excavated. It's rather a gruesome business, but I have many colleagues who are very expert in how to analyse and compare human bones of the skull and the face and the long bones and so forth. The world is full of millions of skeletons, if you think about it. The number of people who've died in the past and are buried somewhere is probably absolutely enormous. Now, oral traditions, well, of course, they're different. They are, by definition, I suppose, the term oral means they're not written down. So they're not fossilized and they're not prepared as history. Oral traditions, as I understand them, tend to be, in the case of Pacific peoples, records of where ancestors come from and the genealogies that descend from those ancestors to modern people. You know, the names of all the ancestors and what they did. And of course we have oral tradition in the Western world. I mean, Homer, the Greek author Homer, the Rig Veda in India, all of those great epics were originally oral tradition before they were written down eventually, often many hundreds of years after they were composed by the civilizations that owned them. Now, whether those oral traditions are history and what is true about them, I mean, obviously, in the case of Homer, we have all this history about the Trojan War. Well, in the 19th century, the site of Troy, or what probably was Troy, was discovered at Hisarlik in Turkey. So often archaeology can expose some of these oral traditions and prove that there is an element of truth in them. But sometimes the details do become rather wonderful and sort of supernatural, of course. And aspects like that, you know, the battles between deities and, as in Hindu epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, we can obviously never really prove that. But interestingly, the Mahabharata does describe cities in northern India that did exist because there are traces of them survive in the archaeological record. So oral tradition is difficult. When it's really ancient, it is difficult. It is sometimes said by my linguist colleagues as well that some tribal groups in Aboriginal Australia have folk memories of the time about 7,000 or 8,000 years ago when the sea level was rising and flooding the continental shelf, which had been previously exposed during the last ice age because the sea levels are much lower. Whether people really can remember that long ago, 8,000 years, about an event such as a rising sea level I'm not totally convinced. But, I mean, oral tradition, yes, it is a source. Also, of course, it's a major source of anthropological knowledge about the functionings of those societies in the past. But as for exact history, I think then you would have to work very hard to extract precise history out of most oral records.
Part of your business here in the Marianas this week is related to the excavation at Unai Baput.
Yes, yes.
Tell us what is your involvement with that.
Well, this is the research of my colleagues Xiao Chun Hong and Mike Carson. Now, because I'm a retired professor at ANU, I apply for research funding, and I've recently had a couple of major research grants from the Australian Research Council to look at the spread of Neolithic, that is, early farming societies throughout Southeast Asia. As I said before, we're working in Vietnam, Taiwan, Philippines, Indonesia, in Sulawesi Island, and also here in the Marianas. Now, Mike and Xiao Chun are part of that project, so they have access to the funding, and at the moment they're using some of the funding to support this work at Unai Baput, because Mike, in particular, Mike Carson, has spent quite a lot of his career working in the Marianas, and he has a connection with the Micronesian Area Research Centre at the University of Guam. So that is basically why I'm here. I decided, since I had the chance to come here, I'd come for a few days and visit the start of their excavation. They're just starting now. They've started a few days ago. So we're going to have a look at the continuing excavation tomorrow.
Well, we're looking forward to interviewing them a little bit closer to the end of their excavation. Yes,
because they're going to find things in a few weeks. Yeah, yes.
Wonderful. Yeah. Looking forward, is there anything on the horizon for either you personally or in the field of archaeology that you're excited about?
Yeah, I think in this part of the world, most of the archaeology that we discover is often a little bit like what has been discovered before. But there are two areas of research that I think are going to tell us a great deal in the very near future. One of them is about the ancient plants that people used to use for food. Now, normally that kind of food disappears, it decays and vanishes. But most plants contain little tiny microscopic elements of silica. They're called phytoliths, and when those plants die, the phytoliths drop into the soil, and they're pretty much indestructible as long as the soil is not disturbed. And they can be analysed under a microscope and identified as particular species. So colleagues like Dr. Chen Zhenhua, who is here working here with us now, he's from from Beijing. He can identify the phytoliths of rice and millet and another crop called Job's tears and other things that survive in the ground. They can also find starch from taro and yam. There's been a lot of that sort of research done recently, and we're hoping to get some results about that from Unai Bapot. The other source of very important information is from human bone. If that can survive well and in good condition in alkaline soils, then it is often possible nowadays, particularly using the dense bone behind the human ear, to extract DNA, ancient DNA. And if that can be done, given modern knowledge of the human genome and the rapid sequencing methods that are available, an enormous amount of information can be recovered about exactly who the individual was, who was buried several thousand years ago. Now, of course, often when we do this kind of research, we need to communicate with local communities of people, especially, of course, in Australia. And in the recent months, there has been an outpouring of new research on DNA from Australian Aboriginal populations. Hopefully, this can be extended further amongst the Chamorro and, of course, the bones of their ancestors from archaeological sites. So those two fields, phytoliths and DNA research, I think are very much the most important things in the immediate future for research.
I think that's very fascinating because up until now, we really had no idea beyond written record what the ancient people were eating. And so it sounds like this branch is going to help us answer that question.
It will help greatly, and it will tell us, hopefully, if they had rice. And that could be very important about their origins, if they had rice when they first arrived.
Well, I want to thank you so much for making time to talk to us and for sharing your knowledge with our listeners. Do you have any final thoughts before we go?
I mean, my hope at the moment is that the project at Unai Bapot will produce important results about Chamorro ancestry, help to fill in some of the gaps, and probably resolve some of the current controversies about where the first people came from.
Well, thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for asking me.
Our guest today has been Dr. Peter Bellwood, Emeritus Professor at the Australian National University, talking a little bit about the first settlers of the Marianas and some other things that are happening in the exciting field of archaeology. This has been your Humanities Half Hour. I'm Catherine Perry.
This program was supported by a We the People grant awarded to the Northern Marianas Humanities Council from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities or the Northern Marianas Humanities Council.